Good morning, good afternoon, excellencies, honorable guests, feminists from all over the world. We are so excited to have you join our official Generation Equality Forum side event, launching a new global partner network for feminist foreign policy. I'm Lyric Thompson. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Center for Research on Women, where we have been engaged in a multi-year process of research, consultation, and exchange to understand what is this growing field of feminist foreign policy, what are these feminists working inside and outside of government doing to advance it, how can we learn from it, how can we extend its impact, how can we build a more feminist future together in our foreign policy and multilateral cooperation. We're so pleased to bring you an incredible panel of distinguished speakers this morning, and we will introduce them in chronological order because this morning we're not totally concerned with diplomatic protocol. We are a feminist collective in a rather flat space. We want to tell you the story of feminist foreign policy. Where did it begin? Where is it today? Where is it going forward, and how can we work together to advance that momentum? So I will be joined in short order. I have a couple of slides for you first, but I will be joined in short order. First, we will hear from Her Excellency Ambassador Ann Burns, who is the Ambassador for Gender Equality and coordinator of the Swedish Feminist Foreign Policy, the world's first feminist foreign policy. We'll then travel to Mexico, where we will hear from Vice Minister Marta Delgado, who leads multilateral affairs and human rights for the Foreign Ministry in Mexico. We'll hear from her about the Mexican experience. Then we'll hear from the Equality Fund's Theo Sawa, who will tell us a bit about the importance of financing to this agenda and a mechanism that Canada has pioneered in this space. And then we have a very exciting announcement for you from the Foreign Minister of Libya, Nala Mangoush, who is the first female foreign minister, and we'll talk to you about a bit about what's happening in her country and her region. We will certainly have time for your questions, and we have our own exciting commitment to launch at the end. If I can have the next slide before we go into the conversation with our speakers, I'd like to just share with you a bit of thinking that a growing collective of feminists working inside and outside of governments to advance feminist foreign policy have pulled together. If you can see the framework slide number 2, please. Thank you. We have distilled in a publication that is available at the link at the bottom of your screen in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic, a few core ingredients of feminist foreign policy. This is what we've learned from our conversations with the 6 governments who have penned feminist foreign policies to date, and with hundreds of feminist activists from dozens of countries on every continent except Antarctica about what feminist foreign policy should be. And just to briefly share that the number one thing that we heard from our conversations was the importance of purpose, of anchoring this approach in feminist principles, such as intersectionality, the sharing and disruption of power, the dismantling of patriarchal structures, colonial structures, racist structures, and other means by which power has traditionally been withheld or coerced. The importance of having a definition, being very clear about what you intend to achieve, and being very precise about the scope of that approach. What agencies or bureaus are responsible for doing this work? How will it be resourced? Who is the lead or coordinator of that effort? What will the intended outcomes and benchmarks over time be? The probably second most important thing that we heard was the importance of accountability, that feminist foreign policy is a way of doing foreign policy very differently than it has traditionally been entertained. Feminist foreign policy needs to be able to say what we seek to change and then be accountable to those goals, working again with feminist movements outside of government, as well as with those brave feminist leaders inside of government trying to pioneer something new. So with that, I will give you the background and introduce our first speaker. We're so excited to travel first to Sweden. Hello, good afternoon, Ambassador Burns. We'd love to hear from you about the Swedish experience and why Sweden elected to have a feminist foreign policy in the first place all those years ago.
Thank you so much, Lyric. It's an honor to be here. And I think, as to answer your question, I think that there were two main reasons, really. The first one being that, in 2014 also, and still, there was no progress or not enough progress for gender equality. It was too slow, uneven, and also increasingly contested. Resulting in women and girls still lagging behind in all countries and in all kinds of areas. And the conclusion stemming from that was that business as before simply wasn't enough. Instead, there was a need for an intensified focus on gender equality and specifically on the rights, representation and resources of women and girls in all their diversity, and with a more systematic, integrated, analytical, across the board and profound approach. So that was the first reason I would say the lack of progress. The second was that there was an explicit wish from the foreign minister at the time to establish gender equality squarely as a peace and security issue, and to contribute to this becoming the new normal. Leaving the notion of gender equality being a women's issue or something only sort of related to the ministers for gender equality far, far behind us. This particular motive, the second one, drew very much on the experiences that our foreign minister at the time, Margaret Wallström, had when she was the Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And during that time, she really saw so many examples of the conflict experiences of traumas of women and girls being regarded and treated as lesser issues, lesser crimes, or even inevitable and normal aspects of war that were not discussed in the peace processes addressing those conflicts. She also saw so many examples of women and girls themselves being absent from the formative discussions on the peace and the future of the societies. So this all went into the conclusion that there was a need to address these issues as peace and security issues in the same rooms, in the same discussions as every other aspect of the conflict situation, and not as something parallel, and certainly not as something less important. So I would say that those are the two key ones. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns. Theo, I'd love to travel to Canada next, which in 2019 or 2017 established their feminist international assistance policy, and then a couple of years subsequently did something very interesting in that with the launch of the Equality Fund. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of financing to this agenda?
Thanks very much, Lyric. So I'm not going to laugh about you traveling to Canada. You're actually traveling to Accra. But actually, that's one of the great things that I found about the Canadian Feminist International Development Assistance Policy that they pulled together. The really large consultation that they did with women's rights organizations and feminists from across the world. So at the time, I was working with the African Women's Development Fund, and we were able to give names and introduce a whole range of feminist organizations who were core to real change in women's lives and in the lives and well-being of communities on the African continent. But we knew that the same thing was happening in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, the importance of feminist movements. But too often we've had rhetoric about gender equality and feminism as being central to the change and the progress and the well-being of the world that wasn't followed through with money. And if you don't have resourcing for the agendas that you are pushing and the issues that you are trying to change, then it does become rhetoric without action. Financing is incredibly important. Ambassador Berners just said rights, representation, and resources. So I'm delighted that the Canadian government found new money to invest in a platform like the Equality Fund, which is being established as a feminist fund for sustainable funding of feminist activity. And I think it's really important that any feminist foreign policy that is established make sure that there is money, and not money just scrambled from other gender equality budgets, but new money, increased money, real money to support feminist movements and women's rights organizations as the policy is implemented. As we stand today, data from the OECD shows that less than 2% of international development assistance that they have been tracking goes to women's rights organizations. And we know that an even smaller proportion of that is going to women's rights organizations in the global south, where so much change is happening. So I absolutely believe in feminist foreign policy. I absolutely think that it is a tool to help us really break some of these very difficult problems and systems of discrimination that we've seen. But it will only be effective if we properly resource the change, and if we make sure that the money and the power involved in money goes into the hands of those women-led organizations, those feminist movements, those movements for equality on the ground. So if we don't have the resources to fund the change, then we end up with rhetoric. And I'd like to think that feminist foreign policy is a lot more than rhetoric.
No rhetoric without resources. I love that. Thank you, Theo. I'm hearing that we're having a bit of connection issue with our Mexican representative. So let's go ahead and move to the big reveal. I'd love to welcome Foreign Minister Nala Mangush to give a few remarks today about some news from Libya. What would you like to tell the world about your thoughts on feminist foreign policy?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this remarkable event. I'm so glad to be among all these feminist leaders, and just to observe the energy from even, online. I can see everybody excited and very, true believer in the feminist role. And it's a pleasure to be among you today. As you said, I've been appointed as the first female foreign minister of my country since March 15, and it's a huge role, challenging, but also exciting to be in that position as a woman, and especially women in transition countries where we're transitioning from war to peace. So there's extra pressure in that, but also I think it's a huge opportunity as well. Well, to answer the first questions, what do you have to tell us about regards to the issue? Lately we have announced, as you know, Libya going through, we have been struggling with civil war almost now 10 years. And then finally, there is a united government have been appointed. They earn the trust from the parliament. And we have 5 actually ministers who are women, 4 beside me, which is considered significant step, in the Libyan policy and Libyan politics. And because because we are going through a lot of security challenges and economical challenges, we announced in Berlin 2 that Berlin 2 it was a conference about Libya. We launched initiative called Libyan Stabilization Initiative. That initiative led by the foreign minister in Libya, by myself with other colleagues from other countries, specifically, the countries, the main members in the Security Council, and also a lot of European countries and Arabic countries who believe in this initiative and want to be part of it. And mainly this initiative is a diplomatic platform which will serve as a Libyan-led, Libyan-owned vehicle to end the protected conflict in Libya. Basically, we have a comprehensive integrated approach which addresses root causes to the conflict, not just quick fix. And the main goals behind it is providing assistance to the government of national unity in the implementation of the roadmap and the holding of a free and fair and transparent election, combating the flow of illicit arms and withdrawal of foreign forces and fighters, countering terrorism and preventing of violent extremism, ending in regard to migration and displacement, supporting Libya and implementing the agenda of women, peace and security, and developing its international action plan. Also, responsibility sharing model, which puts the people at the center of the process and addresses the root causes of the conflict should be adopted. It should be also counterbalance the existence, the power sharing model, human rights-based approach, also rule of law, and most importantly, employ the feminist foreign policy approach to foreign policy, grounded in the following tenets, reconsidering the meaning of security by taking the perspective of marginalized parties into account when designing foreign policy, and also prioritizing the improvement of the standard of living of marginalized communities when making foreign policy decisions. And lastly, upholding the human security and dignity as well as equitable security. So basically, this is the main goals behind this initiative. We have different paths within this initiative: security, sector reform, economical reform, policy reform, and I was pleased that we also would like to emphasize the feminist foreign policy as someone who's leading this ministry, but also as a woman who are in a country that has a lot of conflict and also the history of marginalized communities and women, how we can improve their role and how we can implement that at foreign policy level.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minister. That is such exciting news, and it's music to my ears to hear that this is rooted in a peace-based agenda, in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which of course is a powerful antecedent to the development of feminist foreign policy, and a human rights-based approach. We wish you all the best in your efforts and in your new role, and we're excited to watch it unfold and to support you and to learn from you. It doesn't appear that we have our Mexican speaker at the moment, so I am going to come back to you, Ambassador Burns, to talk a little bit about impact, which is to say, what have you seen in the years that Sweden has been implementing its feminist foreign policy that has changed?
Yes, I would say that we have, achieved change, both internally and externally. Internally, there is no doubt, and colleagues will witness to that, that we have gone through an institutional culture shift, and a social one. In practice, this has meant that instead of having some colleagues working with gender equality as the whole portfolio as part of the portfolio, we nowadays have a whole foreign service working with an intersectional gender lens at all levels, in all contexts, in all kinds of foreign policy issues, and every day. This, in turn, and you only have to apply maths to this, has contributed to change also externally, with so many more hearts and minds and hands being involved. And we've worked to foster and institutionalize the same kind of approach and institutional culture shift everywhere else, be it at country level or in the UN Security Council, where we were a non-permanent member in 2017-18, or in the OSCE, where we're now the chair, the EU, the World Trade Organization, the development banks, the climate funds, the COVID-19 response, everywhere. What we have seen is that this systematic way of working has produced results and change. In relation to all the 3 R's that I mentioned in the beginning, rights, representation, and resources, both in our own case, and we've been able to see that we've also influenced others. And all the thematic goals that we formulated in 2015, be it in relation to gender-based violence, to sexual and reproductive health and rights, to political and economic empowerment, and to peace, women, peace and security. And also, I would say, in relation to the world, the discourse, and the priorities of foreign policy. And one obvious example is that there are now several countries pursuing a feminist foreign policy, and several more being interested, both in that approach and, generally raising the profile of gender equality within the realm of foreign policy as such. You also asked, I think, what we've learned. And I think that one of the most important lessons is that we've learned that change is possible, even in a situation where it seems to be insurmountable. And that change, and even substantial change, which is, I would say this is an example of that. It does, because it relates to mindset, changing mindsets. It does not have to take years and years. It can go very quickly, actually. Thanks.
Wonderful news. Minister Mangoush, I'd love to ask you if you would comment a bit on what you see in terms of the possible impact for your efforts in your region, and any ripple effects that you think we might see.
Well, I echo the ambassador's statement about change is possible, considering the fact that, as I mentioned, we are a country. We went through a history of conflict and division and violence and trauma as well. But as someone also studied trauma and studied peace building as my academic background, I believe that change is possible if we put our heart and our thoughts, and we strategically think about ways and methodologies to implement that. I know it takes a long time, but at least we can start somewhere. And this is where we think this initiative can play a role in that dimension. So I believe our launching of the feminist foreign policy would not only help Libya in achieving its stabilization, but will also stabilize our region by having a comprehensive, integrated approach which addresses root causes of the conflict, not just quick fix, as I mentioned before. For example, in our initiatives as regards to securing the borders, we have developed mechanisms of securing the borders of Libya is essential to stabilization. The elements of this mechanism include the following: urging all countries and parties involved to act in accordance with national humanitarian law, effectively and generously support Libya as well as other parties to end any unjust policies, practices on land and at sea, support international humanitarian organizations saving lives to sea and work effectively with source countries in every way to bring a human end and suffering with full respect of human rights, laws, and Libyan interests. Also grounding policies and measures of securing the borders in the idea that securing the borders does not mean militarizing the borders, but also building arrangement to return unregulated immigrants and citizens who are victims of human trafficking to their country with dignity, include women and also young girls who suffer from those circumstances, and also sanction those violating the arms embargo, and drawing a plan for gradual reductions of numbers of immigrants in detention until the detention centers are closed. This is also a problem that we're facing in Libya with all the complexity and the absence of rule of law. How we can save women and young generations and who are facing this dignified situation, traveling from borders, considering the fact that Libya actually is a transit country. It's not the destiny for many immigrants who come from Africa, but also we are obligated as a country, even we are struggling with all the security challenges, we need to make sure also we can secure the minimum respect and dignity to those immigrants, include women and young generation. Thank you.
Have we lost Theo? Do we still have Theo? I only see.
Yes, I'm still
Wonderful.
here.
Oh, there's Dr. Okay, sorry, Theo. I see Dr. Bainas now. Very warm welcome to Dr. Christopher Bainas, who is the Director General for Human Rights and Democracy in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, and has been a champion and architect of the Mexican feminist foreign policy. Dr. Bainas, we do regret the delay, and we're so delighted to see you. Please tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in Mexico these last year plus. Christopher, I don't think we can hear your sound, or at least I can't. Oh, there you are. I think I hear you now.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon in Europe. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a student of my the website of who we are. We have to say thank you very much for the kind words of the invitation, because Mexico became the very first country to develop South foreign policy. This is really difficult. Sometimes it's many people think it's just a question of political decision, but it's actually to try to put together some major things, especially in the institution, really wise. Because you don't only need to make the announcement, you have to compromise yourself not only for this year, but the next coming year. So this is important to keep in mind. Secondly, it's a question, it's also a question of honoring an historical commitment on gender equality that Mexico put into place having the very first World Conference on Women in Mexico in 1975. So this is important because we are planning to continue having this commitment on gender rights. So for us in this space, it's a really good way to continue to provide later of the first conference. But secondly, it's a way to start this year. Actually, we're planning for the that year in the context of the generation equality. One of the things I want to highlight is not only the compromise of having a gender perspective that comes together with a gender perspective that includes point the emphasis, but also to maintain basic regulation or any kind of sexual harassment or so this is the kind of things I can say in this
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bainas. Your sound was a little muffled sometimes, but I heard the emphasis on intersectionality and the various metrics that you have established to track change throughout your process, which is very exciting. Theo, if I could return to you. So far, we've been very focused on what governments are doing, but as we know that all of these good ideas have also been sourced from the feminist movements and from civil society who have been championing feminist principles in foreign and domestic policy. I'd love to give you the floor to talk a bit about how feminist foreign policy can support those movements, and also if you'd care to reflect on any challenges and how feminists outside of government can be allies in holding these policies to the very high standards for which we have for them. Theo.
Thank you, Lyric. So first, I suppose I'll come back to the emphasis that I had earlier on actually resourcing the feminist foreign policies. But I did want to echo what has been said by my three fellow panelists about the importance of intersectionality, that any successful feminist foreign policy really is looking at the types of inequality, of discrimination, but also of opportunity progress that we're looking to forward. And that means that, yes, feminist foreign policy can make governments and can push the private sector, etc., to better fight for gender equality. But just as importantly, as Ambassador Burns mentioned earlier, can use their influence with other governments, with their governments, can use their influence with private sector actors to really ensure that everyone is beginning to look differently at the centrality of gender equality, but that everyone is looking in an integrated way at the opportunities that feminist foreign policy offers to really have a much more a much more in-step approach to economics, to politics, to social issues, to racial issues, to disability issues, to all of the issues that we as feminist movements have actually been fighting to change. Just as an example of that, I think that work that you and ICRW have been doing on feminist foreign policy with this whole range of individual women's rights organizations, but also works of women's rights organizations has been really important, because you've been able to produce information to help governments have a much better understanding of the potential of a feminist foreign policy, but also to really learn from the experiences of Mexico and Sweden and Canada and others. I think the two final things that I'll say, I think it's really important for us as feminists, or one of the things we've learned as civil society actors and feminists, is that you don't always need to have a feminist foreign policy to take actions that are feminist in outcome. And so we have governments like the Netherlands who do not have a feminist foreign policy, but have been remarkable about really listening to feminist movements and to actors working on equality to really think about what is it that they should be financing through their international development assistance. What are the issues and advocacy that they should be working on in their office and with their networks? And I think that this alliance of like-minded governments with these mutual interests in improving the well-being of the world and improving outcomes for justice and for equality, it's really important for them to work together with feminist actors who are outside of government, and that with the internal and the external better working together, we get better outcomes. And even though sometimes that's uncomfortable, because sometimes as feminists outside of government, we will be pushing and saying, you need to do more. And how can this economic policy really match up to what you're saying in your feminist foreign policy? But I think all of that, as long as it's done with our joint names around equality and justice in mind gets all of us further. It gets the governments with feminist foreign policy further. It gets those without thinking more in feminist ways, and it gets us towards those outcomes that we're all pushing for.
Beautifully said, as usual. Thank you for that, Theo. And it's a wonderful segue into our final announcement for the program before we go to your questions in the audience, which is we're very excited today to launch as an official commitment under Action Coalition 6 on feminist movement and leadership, a new global partner network for feminist foreign policy, which is exactly the kind of space for exchange that Theo has just so beautifully described. This is a place where we will continue to deepen understanding and engagement and exchange of ideas, research, resources on this fledgling field of feminist foreign policy, working together with those governments who have been so bold as to call something feminist. And I couldn't agree more, Theo, with your sentiment that it is the content that matters more than the label of the container. But if we are going to call something feminist, that really is signaling the highest degree of ambition, an intersectional approach, and that this is a growing group of actors who will be working to refine those ideas, to advance them, and to ensure maximum impact. So we have more than 30 organizations, several of whom you see on the screen. You've also heard from some of our champions in government. This will be a space to continue this dialogue, to learn, to measure results, to hold things accountable, and to create and build that trust between feminists working inside and outside of government to advance this field. We'd love to have you join us. Please do reach out to us if you would like to be involved in the network. And with that, I think we do have our first audience question, which I will share with our panelists now. It's not directed to any single panelist, so I think if anyone would like to jump in or raise your hand, we'd love to hear from you. The audience member says that it's very inspiring to hear what's going on with feminist foreign policy. They'd like to hear a little bit more about what this means in areas of trade, defense, and migration. Would anyone like to take a crack at that? Okay, Dr. Bainas.
Thank you very much. Actually, as you were saying, Rick is in Mexico. We put together this idea of put a gender perspective in every single part of our foreign policy, and of course, has an impact on our domestic policy. Actually, right now, Mexico is launching a resolution in the Human Rights Council with an emphasis on women and migration, but also on girls, especially because the impact of many of the social problems we are facing in the world right now it has a worse impact on women and girls. So this is something that has to do with the question. And actually, as you were saying, it's a question of intersectionality. We also put a gender perspective on trade, and of course, all our international agreement has to put some kind of gender perspective on trade agreement. Or also in migration, or also in social matters, in climate change and environment, and of course many other, let's say, traditional topics that we usually relate with women and girls. So this is important to keep in mind. You don't have to work only in one branch, but also in many topics related with gender rights and of course girls' rights. I will put it here right now like this.
Wonderful, thank you. From what we've heard from civil society, this is very important, the importance of coherence of these feminist principles and approach across all streams of foreign policy. I see Ambassador Burns would like to come in.
Yeah, I can only agree. And, some examples of how we have worked concretely is that in 2017, we and like-minded, we worked to process and then to achieve the fact that the World Trade Organization adopted its first ministerial declaration on gender and trade. at the ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires. We've launched, as part of our overall policy, we also launched a feminist trade policy. And what we've seen also, and also sort of added together with UNCTAD and also the International Trade Center, worked on toolboxes of how to analyze a situation before a trade agreement is met, to make that agreement, as just as possible for a whole population, and to address the needs and the market for everyone, so that it can be as inclusive and productive as possible for everyone. So that is one example, just in one of the areas mentioned.
Wonderful. And I know in trade, this is an area where there's a lot of good work to be done. So far, no bilateral trade agreement has ever included women's rights or gender equality in the binding sections of that agreement. So goals to shoot for. Theo, did you want to come in on that question, or we do have another question from the audience? It's up to you.
Go ahead with the next question.
Wonderful. The next question, and we did lose Minister Mangush, who has a flight to catch. She sends her regards and is delighted to be a part of the conversation. We're very excited to see what she does next. So our next question from the audience is about decolonization. So the question of how
I can try. It's a tough one.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah, see you next time. Well, area, but since we've had this angle to everything we do, of course it comes up in every file and every dossier. What I didn't mention was that apart from the 3 R's, rights, representation and resources, we also always work with the fourth one, the reality check. So we always have to be based in that context where we work, so that we don't do any harm, that we actually pinpoint the most acute issues, and as you pointed to, always in dialogue with local actors and women's rights organizations and civil society as a whole. That is the only way of being sustainable, efficient, and credible, and avoid preaching, which is something that you really have to avoid, and which no one has any right to do in these matters. We all have so many challenges wherever we are in the world. So if that addresses the question, I don't know, but that is how we've gone about it.
Thank you for that. And I know that this has been a very keen focus of our work, and the definition in the framework does name colonialism and racism as explicit objectives that feminist foreign policy should seek to dismantle. I see Theo would like to come in. Please, you have the floor.
Just to say that this is one of those really knotty issues, but this is why having a feminist foreign policy, as opposed to it's still an ambitious thing, working on gender equality is so important because of that tonality. And we know that as feminists, decolonization issues, looking at the way which our systems have promoted systematic discrimination against not only women and girls, but also different parts of different populations in the global north, against Black and people of color populations across the globe, against people with different abilities. In terms of economic discrimination, the mindset of feminism is that all of these issues are interlinked, and we do not promote one equality at the expense of other equalities. So it's really important. This is where feminist movements are so important to policies, because frankly, we've all been through the same types of education systems, whether we're in government or in civil society or in the private very often people's default thinking and default actions are extraordinarily colonial or are rooted in colonial systems which promote different discriminations. That's why it's so important to be deliberate about a feminist approach that is intersectional. And that's why I think it's to be deliberate about funding those feminist movements who are on the ground and who are experiencing the discrimination and who have come up with so many amazing and innovative ideas of how to approach this. And that's where linkages between governments and those actors and movements on the ground are so important, and why platforms that feminists have developed, like the Black Feminist Fund, the Equality Fund, the National and Regional Women's Funds, platforms like Leading from the South. That's why they're so important, because they can make the linkages and they can push for intersectional approaches and change, real change. But it's hard, and we all have to work at it.
That's perfectly said, and I think a perfect summary of exactly the feminist vision that we are all working towards together. We have come to the end of our time together. It's not enough 45 minutes to begin to even scratch the surface of such an ambitious agenda and such a complicated one. I'm grateful to the organizers of the Generation Equality Forum, the governments of Mexico, France, and UN Women. I'm deeply grateful to those folks that you see on screen who have been champions of this work, and to the many myriad other activists inside and outside of government who have been working to get us to where we are today. We hope you will join us in the Global Partner Network to advance this field. We hope you have found what you've heard this morning or afternoon inspiring, and we look forward to working together to achieve generation equality. Be well.